our today's class, that is cholinergic receptors. And what are the classification of cholinergic receptors? They are classified into muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptor. So in morning class, that is earlier we have discussed that sympathomimetic adrenergic system is divided into alpha and beta receptor. But here, this cholinergic system is divided into two different type of receptors, muscarinic receptors and nicotinic receptor. Now, what is the purpose behind, or what is the principle behind this classification? Why these names are given, that is muscarinic receptor and nicotinic receptor? Now, we have already discussed there are two distinct classes of types on which this acetylcholine drug molecule or acetylcholine neurotransmitter is going to react. That is a cholinergic receptor, muscarinic receptor and nicotinic receptor. म्हणजे cholinergic receptors are classified into two classes, muscarinic receptor and nicotinic receptor. Now, कोणत्या basis वरती this classification is done? What is the principle behind this classification? This classification is depending upon the actions of two alkaloids on which those alkaloids are going to bind and show their action. So they are characterized by nicotinic and muscarinic on the basis of their ability to bind with a naturally occurring alkaloid, that is nicotine and muscarine. So these cholinergic system, cholinergic receptors, this nicotinic receptor will bind with a naturally occurring alkaloid, that is nicotine. So on the basis of that, the name is given nicotinic receptor. Whereas a muscarinic receptor is a receptor which will bind with the muscarine. So both these classes or both these receptors have their subclasses, that is depending upon their location and specificity, the receptors are further classified. But we'll discuss first about a cholinergic receptor. What do you mean by cholinergic receptor? This is a chemical site in the effector cell or at a synapse on which neurotransmitter is going to react? Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter is going to show or exert its action. Ace receptors on which the acetylcholine neurotransmitter will be showing its action. So the name of the receptor is a cholinergic receptors. And a cholinergic receptors will respond only to the neurotransmitter, that is acetylcholine in the neurosynapse. See, these are the two nerve endings of two different nerves, and here there will be a release of neurotransmitters. So a preganglionic nerve will release a neurotransmitter, and whereas the second nerve will catch this response. So those all receptors are situated on the nerve ending of second nerve. So in this way, the neurotransmitter is released, which is stored in the vesicle and which will be catched by those receptors. Which receptors? Either nicotinic receptor or muscarinic receptor, depending upon their location. So the human brain has a huge number of synapses. Now we know our brain is surrounded by a total nervous system. So we all know a huge number of synapses will be there, and each of them has 10 to 1100 millions of neurons. And these 1100 millions of neurons, average amount have 7,000 synaptic connections. So this is a channel, or this is a mesh-like structure which I have shown here. That is, this is going to have the 7,000 synaptic connection. This is a synaptic connection. So approximately we are going to have 7,000 synaptic connections to the other neurons. Now, we all know we have already classified a cholinergic receptor classification or classified into two classes, nicotinic receptor and muscarinic receptor. Depending upon that, which receptor will bind with which naturally occurring alkaloid. Now this receptor will bind to the nicotine alkaloid. That's why the name of the receptor is nicotinic receptor. And the next class will be a muscarinic receptor, on which the muscarine is the alkaloid will be bind. So we have already discussed that. Now, what is the location and on which this neurotransmitter will going to show his action? So acetylcholine receptors are situated in the central nervous system also. It is situated in autonomic nervous system also, and as well as in between the junction, that is neuromuscular junction. Now, the nicotinic receptor, the cholinergic receptors, which are going to have his presence in the central nervous system, are both. Both receptors are present in central nervous system. Both receptors are present in autonomic nervous system. Whereas in the case of neuromuscular junction, that is nerve ending and the muscle junction, only there will be a presence of nicotinic receptors. Now, we will further classify these nicotinic receptors into. Now, these nicotinic receptors are further classified into N1 or NM. Now, that N1 or NM belongs to the presence of nicotinic receptor in the neuromuscular junction. आता neuromuscular junction means what? Nerve आणि muscle मध्ये असणारं junction. Now, the presence of the second type is N2 or NN. N2 or NN belongs to the junction is between the autonomic ganglia, CNS and adrenal medulla. This is in between the two nerve ending, neural junction, we can call them. And this is neuromuscular junction. So this type of junction is with the two nerves. And this junction is between the nerve and muscle cell. Now why or how come they are classified? The nicotinic receptors are located in the neuromuscular junction. They are differ from those in the neurons. They are going to have their presence in the CNS. Now this neuromuscular junction or NN is going to have their presence in the CNS, autonomic ganglia and adrenal medulla. They are going to have these nicotinic receptors at the neuromuscular junction, that is N1, are blocked by the succinylcholine. So this receptor will be blocked by the succinylcholine or D-tubocurarine and decamethonium, or these are stimulated by phenyl trimethyl amino derivatives. This is about neuromuscular junction receptors. So they are blocked by the tubocurarine molecules. Now the next receptor is N2. They are found in the autonomic ganglia, central nervous system, which are blocked by hexamethonium and trimethoprim, and they are stimulated by tetramethyl ammonium as well as dimethylphenyl piperazinium. Now these nicotinic receptor subtypes have also been identified in many regions of the CNS. So they are going to have their presence in many regions of the CNS, but their pharmacological actions are totally not understood. Both of them pharmacological actions till yet not understood, but they have their role in the central nervous system. Now we will discuss about the location, function, what are the agonists, what are the antagonists, and what will be the transducer mechanism for the individual receptor. The nicotinic receptors, they are further classified into NM and NN. NM belongs to neuromuscular junction, N1 receptor, and N2 belongs to neural junction, that is N2 receptor. So what is the location of first receptor? It is present in the neuromuscular junction, and the neuroreceptor will be present on the autonomic ganglia, adrenal medulla, and the CNS. So the function performed by the first receptor is depolarization of motor end plane and contraction of the skeletal muscle. See, yesterday we have seen that depolarization. Depolarization means entry of potassium ions. We have seen that. What is the mechanism of parasympathetic nervous system? The parasympathetic nervous system is going to have the resting potential or the rest mechanism. So we have to make the cell depolarize. Now how we are going to make the cell depolarize? By increasing entry of potassium channels or potassium ions inside the cell. And the increased amount of potassium ions inside the cell will make the cell depolarize, will make the muscle depolarize, so that depolarization of motor end plane and contraction of the smooth muscle. But the neural junction have different function. It is going to depolarize postganglionic impulse, adrenal medulla, catecholamine release, central nervous system function, and excitation or inhibition type of function. Now the next is agonist. On the neuromuscular junction or the neuromuscular receptor, nicotine is the agonist, and on the second N2 receptor, nicotine and DMPP. DMPP belongs to dimethyl 4-phenylpiperazinium. So this dimethyl 4-phenylpiperazinium is the agonist. Agonist means going to increase the mechanism of action, and antagonist means it is going to block the action. So the blocking or the antagonist for the N1 receptor is tubocurarine, whereas the antagonist for the NN receptor is hexamethonium and trimethophan. Now transducer mechanism. So opening of sodium and potassium channel, and in the case of NN receptor, opening of sodium, potassium and calcium channel. These receptors, that is N1 receptors, are located at the neuromuscular junction. The acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter which will bind to this a receptor. See, this is the nicotinic receptor, and this is the neurotransmitter which is released from the synaptic vesicles, will bind with the receptor in this way. Whereas in the case of N2 or NN receptor, as mentioned before, nicotinic receptor play a key role in the transmission of cholinergic signals. Cholinergic signals are those signals which is produced by the acetylcholine in the autonomic nervous system. Now the nicotinic receptors of the N2 subtype can be found at both. See, the presence of this N2 receptor is on the both cholinergic as well as adrenergic ganglia, but not at the target tissue. So they are going to have their presence at both cholinergic ganglia as well as adrenergic ganglia, but don't have their target tissues. For example, heart, bladder. These receptors are also present in the CNS and adrenal medulla. Now, this is a classification or class of nicotinic receptors. So we have seen that nicotinic receptors are classified into two classes, N1 and N2. N1 will be called as NM and N2 will be called as NN. Now, the second class of receptor is muscarinic receptor, classified into 5 types: M1, M2, M3, M4 and M5. Now these are 5 classes are depending upon their location. Now muscarinic receptors play an essential role in regulating the functions of organs on which they are going to have their presence. The action of acetylcholine on these all muscarinic receptors can result in the stimulation or inhibition of the organ system affected. See, the action of acetylcholine On these are all receptors is depending upon on which the it is going to be associated. Now, acetylcholine on muscarinic receptors will stimulate the secretion from salivary glands, sweat glands, secretion and contraction of the gut, and constriction of respiratory airways. Now, we have already discussed that they are going to have the 5 different classes, that is M1 to M5. Now, these all 5 classes have their agonist and antagonist. The first 3 classes, that is M1, M2 and M3, they are corresponding to the genetically defined subtypes, that is M1, M2 and M3. The receptor M4 is a gene-derived protein which is referred to as M4 and has many pharmacological properties. This M4 receptor is going to have many pharmacological properties similar to those with the M2 receptor. The M5 receptor is a gene product, does not have any equivalent pharmacological action. See, the presence of M1, M4 and M3 are on the CNS, whereas out of these 5 receptors, only M1 and M4 is going to have its effects, out of which the M4 subtype has many pharmacological properties, but the M5 receptor is a gene product and does not going to show any pharmacological profile. The location of M2 receptor is on the heart. The location of M3 receptor is on the smooth muscles. So the muscarinic receptor subtypes, role of muscarinic subtypes in the CNS. So the role of M1 is selective impairment of memory function. M2, learning and memory deficits, antagonist shown to enhance the memory. M3 receptor, no major defects in learning, memory or cognitive function. M4 is the antagonist shown to enhance the acetylcholine level in the stratum. And the 5th receptor, that is M5, here there will not be any major pharmacological action. Now, the location and function. Location of M1 is on the autonomic ganglia, paracrine cell gastroglands. M2 is on the sinoatrial node of the heart, arterioventricular node of the heart, and presynaptic terminal, whereas M3 is located on the exocrine gland, smooth muscle, and vascular endothelium. So the functions of M1 receptor is increased gastric secretion, CNS excitation, and GI motility. Decrease the rate of impulse generation in the case of M2, velocity of conduction, bradycardia, contractibility. M3 is increasing in the exocrine secretion, smooth muscle contraction. Now the next class is mechanism. They are going to show their mechanism by inositol triphosphate, diacylglycerol increasing in the calcium conclusion. Then M2 receptor is inhibition of adrenal release by decreasing the cyclic AMP catecholamine O-methyl transferase, opening of potassium channel, and same as the M1 receptor. Agonist, oximetrazole, oxytrimorine, methacholine, and betacholine. So the agonist for different receptors are different. Oxytrimorine is the receptor for M1. D-tuborine is the receptor for methacholine. Methacholine and betacholine are the M3 receptor. Now the antagonists are piperazine, telenzypine, then M2 receptor antagonist is tryptamine, and M3 receptor antagonist is tolmirodine and derifacin. M1, M4, M5 receptor. We have seen that they are going to have their location in the central nervous system. These receptors are involved in the complex CNS responses such as memory arousal, attention, and analgesia. M1 receptors are also found at gastric parietal cells and autonomic ganglia. See, we have seen the location of M1, M4, and M5 are in the CNS, and they are involved in the CNS responses such as memory arousal, means lakshat ठेवण्याचं mechanism, then attention and analgesia. M2 receptor, activation of M2 receptor lowers conduction and velocity of sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes, that thus they are going to lower the heart rate. M3, they have their presence on the smooth muscles. Activation of M3 receptor at the smooth muscle level produces responses on variety of organs, which include bronchial tissue, bladder, exocrine gland, among the other organs. So the classification of adrenergic system with the cholinergic system. What is the definition of adrenergic receptors? Are the autonomic receptors which bind to the adrenaline and noradrenaline, that is epinephrine and norepinephrine. But in the case of cholinergic system, cholinergic receptors are bind to the acetylcholine. Responsible nervous system in the case of adrenergic is sympathetic nervous system, but in the case of cholinergic is parasympathetic nervous system. Responding to the neurotransmitters adrenaline, noradrenaline, किंवा epinephrine or norepinephrine, here there will be acetylcholine. Types of receptors here alpha beta receptors, and in the case of cholinergic system nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. That's why a parasympathetic nervous system or parasympathomimetic agent, mimetic agents means those they are going to increase the response to the parasympathetic system are known as cholinergic agents. And they this cholinergic synapse and neuroeffector junction mediate the pharmacological action through the cholinergic receptors. Parasympathomimetic or cholinergic drugs are those drugs which mimic the action of parasympathetic system. So the actions shown by parasympathomimetic actions are meiosis or contraction of the pupil, lacrimal gland stimulates secretion, salivary gland watery secretion, heart decreasing in the heart rate, blood pressure decrease in the blood pressure, trachea and bronchi contraction, gastrointestinal tract, the muscle motility and the tone, and on the blood vessel, they are going to dilate the blood vessels. So this is the image which will show us the parasympathetic actions or parasympathetic system, which will constrict pupil, stimulate salivary glands, constrict the bronchi, slows heart rate, stimulate peristalsis, and contraction of the bladder. So already we have discussed cholinergic agonist, nicotinic agonist, and muscarinic agonist. So this is from my side for this cholinergic system. Today we will stop here. Okay. Shukrada, are you there?